In the late 1980s, a fortified mountain pass became the laboratory for a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. When the TOS-1 arrived, it did not enter the battlefield to fight, it entered to erase the very concept of safety. In just 180 seconds, a single salvo shattered a century of faith in concrete, steel, and depth, exposing a truth that no bunker could shelter from. Survival itself had a limit. How does a machine unleash a localized atmospheric collapse? And why did this demonstration mark a red line from which military doctrine would never return? The answer begins with the armored sledgehammer that turned landscape into a kill zone. The machine arrived under a shroud of secrecy, a 30-tube behemoth perched atop the battered frame of a T-72 tank. Its purpose was not to breach a line or silence a gun, but to remove the very notion of sanctuary. In the late 1980s, at the mouth of a mountain pass carved deep into hostile rock, the TOS-1 Buratino was given a single order: erase resistance. Command logs later recovered from that operation record the sequence in stark mechanical language: target coordinates relayed, launcher set, safety checks engaged, then a single command to fire. Within seconds, the launcher spat a dozen rockets into the narrow gorge. Each warhead carried a chemical promise: liquid fuel, finely atomized, drifting with the wind into every crevice, every crack in the stone. A second salvo followed, saturating the air itself. Witnesses described a thunder that did not echo, but pressed inward, as if the mountain was exhaling its last breath. Pressure gauges placed by Soviet engineers registered a spike beyond known artillery, then a sudden, unnatural drop, the signature of a vacuum phase. Inside the bunkers and caves, air vanished. Concrete cracked, steel doors buckled, and the myth of the impregnable redoubt collapsed in real time. The entire engagement, from fire order to withdrawal, was over in less than 3 minutes. After-action reports would later struggle to explain the completeness of the devastation. No conventional weapon had ever erased a fortified grid square so quickly or so thoroughly. The armored sledgehammer had not just broken through defenses, it had pulverized the very idea of safety. The forensic question lingered in the silence that followed. What force could turn air into a weapon and survival into a fleeting illusion? The architecture of the TOS-1 Buratino reveals a machine designed for a single, unblinking purpose. Engineers at the Omsk Design Bureau stripped the T-72 main battle tank of its turret, replacing it with a low-profile armored box housing 24 launch tubes, each precisely bored to 220 millimeters. This was not a weapon for duels across open fields or distant artillery exchanges. Its form followed a different logic: concentrated short-range devastation. The launcher array, arranged in tight geometric rows, allowed the crew to unleash a full salvo in under 10 seconds, each rocket carrying a thermobaric payload meant to overwhelm not just structures, but the very air within a target zone. The integration of the T-72 chassis was no accident.
If you're enjoying this content, subscribe now.
The tank's V84 diesel engine, delivering up to 840 horsepower, provided the necessary mobility and armor to bring the launcher within striking distance of hardened positions. The vehicle retained its NBC protection system, shielding the three-man crew from the chemical and thermal aftershocks of their own weapon. Stability was ensured by rear outriggers, bracing the machine against the recoil of a near-simultaneous rocket barrage. Reloading was a calculated process. The TZMT resupply vehicle, itself armored and based on the same T-72 platform, carried spare rockets and a crane, enabling rapid rearmament under threat. Every detail, from the electronic fire control suite to the armored vision blocks, reflected the system's role as an armored sledgehammer, built not for maneuver, but for the deliberate erasure of resistance within a defined grid square. This was engineering in service of a singular battlefield mandate: to turn environment into weapon and to leave no refuge untouched. Inside the Ministry of Defense, frustration simmered. Years of mountain warfare had exposed the limits of conventional firepower. Artillery shells shattered rocks, but left defenders alive behind concrete and earth. The Panjshir Valley, with its network of caves and reinforced bunkers, became a symbol of the problem. No matter how many shells rained down, resistance endured. GRAU, the main missile and artillery directorate, circulated internal memos warning that the Red Army faced a wall of static defenses immune to standard weapons. In these documents, a phrase surfaced again and again. Red Line described not just a tactical boundary, but a threshold of acceptable destruction. Crossing it meant deploying a weapon that would erase the distinction between cover and exposure, sanctuary and target. The TOS-1 Buratino was green-lit as a direct answer to this impasse. Planners did not seek a marginal improvement. They wanted a weapon that would collapse the very logic of fortification. The procurement files from the late 1970s and early 1980s show a shift in priorities. The call was for an area denial system capable of saturating a grid square with thermobaric force, not just to breach, but to nullify. The GRAU sponsorship, documented under the designation Object 634, bypassed traditional artillery channels and placed the project under the NBC protection troops, an admission that the intended effect was more than explosive. In closed-door meetings, senior officers debated the risks. The Red Line label reflected a fear of both escalation and precedent. But the calculus was simple. As long as the enemy could vanish into the mountains, the war would grind on. The Buratino offered a new kind of certainty. Its promise was not just to destroy, but to make survival itself a question mark inside the blast zone. The machine was not a response to a single battle, but to a doctrine that had failed. In the end, the decision was made to unleash the armored Sledgehammer and redraw the boundaries of what was possible on the modern battlefield. The mountain pass chosen for the demonstration was not just any stretch of hostile terrain. It was a fortress sculpted into the landscape, a showcase of Soviet-era engineering and Afghan improvisation, a perfect laboratory for the armored Sledgehammer. Concrete terraces rose in staggered layers up the rock face, each tier bristling with firing slits and observation posts. From above, the layout resembled a chessboard, every move calculated to funnel attackers into carefully plotted kill zones. Reinforced bunkers, sunk deep into the mountainside, connected by narrow winding tunnels. Blast doors of steel and concrete sealed the entrances, while ventilation shafts and escape hatches threaded through the rock like veins. Defenders moved as a single organism, cycling between firing positions and fallback shelters, trusting in the thickness of their walls and the centuries-old logic that earth and stone could blunt any assault. The pass itself narrowed to a choke point less than 30 meters wide, a natural bottleneck that had repelled waves of attackers long before the arrival of mechanized war. Soviet intelligence had mapped every contour, every blind angle, every potential avenue of retreat. Yet the very density of these defenses, the concentration of men, material, and hope within a confined grid, transformed the site from sanctuary to trap. In the calculus of thermobaric warfare, such fortifications became liabilities. Each sealed door and hidden shaft offered not protection, but a pathway for the weapon's aerosol cloud to infiltrate. The defenders' faith in depth and concrete would soon be tested against a force designed to erase the distinction between inside and out, between shield and target. The environment, once their greatest ally, now stood ready to betray them. The countdown began long before the first rocket left its tube. On the ridge above Bashka, the TOS-1 crew worked through a ritual of calculation and control. Commander Vladimir Kuznetsov, eyes fixed on his fire control panel, called for wind readings, gusts below 5 meters per second, humidity hovering at 38%. These numbers mattered. Too much wind and the fuel cloud would scatter harmlessly into the valley, too little and the aerosol might pool too dense to ignite. The gunner, Igor Sokolov, dialed in elevation 15 degrees, while the driver, Sergei Petrov, kept the vehicle braced against the slope, outriggers biting into fractured rock. A laser rangefinder swept the gorge, returning coordinates with a 10-meter margin. The pass was barely 2.6 kilometers distant, close enough for the thermobaric rockets to reach their ideal dispersion zone. The air was thin, the sun just cresting the peaks, and the valley's geometry promised perfect containment. Soviet meteorological doctrine dictated these launches. Optimal humidity between 30 and 45%, wind under 6 meters per second, temperature above -10. Every variable was weighed, every risk measured against the need for complete saturation. The crew sealed hatches and activated the NBC filtration system. The machine was now cut off from the outside world, its 3 operators isolated behind armored glass and steel. Inside, the only sounds were filtered breaths and the mechanical whir of targeting servos. Outside, the mountain pass remained silent, unaware of the calculations unfolding above. In these final moments, the TOS-1 was not simply a weapon, it was a carefully tuned instrument, waiting for the atmosphere itself to become ammunition. The fuel cloud did not respect barriers. As the rockets burst overhead, their contents atomized into a dense mist, drifting invisible and silent through the air. Droplets, each less than 1/10 of a millimeter across, moved on wind currents, searching for the smallest gaps. Vents designed for fresh air became open doors. Seams in blast doors, hairline cracks in concrete, the mesh of filters already straining against dust, all became points of entry. Within moments, the interior of every bunker and tunnel was infiltrated. The defenders, sealed behind reinforced walls, could not see the danger advancing. They trusted in filters, in pressure doors, in the logic of fortification. But the aerosol moved with physics, not intent, flowing with the pressure gradient, drawn by the very systems meant to keep men alive. Ventilation fans, running at full power, pulled the outside air in, carrying the fuel deeper. Charcoal filters and dust screens, designed for chemical agents, became saturated and then overwhelmed. The mist seeped beneath doors and pooled in the lowest recesses, clinging to cold stone and steel. There was no alarm, no visible change, just a gradual, silent saturation. Inside, the air itself was transformed, loaded with potential energy, waiting for a spark. Concrete, steel, and distance offered no safety. The boundaries between outside and inside had dissolved. The stage was set for a new kind of destruction, one that would not simply break walls, but erase the very idea of a sealed refuge. Ignition does not begin with a single explosion. It starts with a chain reaction in the air itself. Each rocket's nose cone bursts open, releasing a fine mist of liquid fuel that spreads invisibly, seeping into cracks and tunnels, pooling in every dead space. The valley becomes a sealed vessel, primed for catastrophe. Then, milliseconds later, the delayed fuse triggers. The entire aerosol cloud ignites at once, producing a flame front that burns hotter than 3,700 degrees Celsius. The fireball is not content to stay in the open. It surges into bunkers, wraps around corners, and follows the path of least resistance. The pressure wave arrives in 2 distinct pulses. The first is a wall of force, hammering concrete and flesh alike with overpressure exceeding 30 atmospheres. The second is a vacuum, a sudden collapse that rips doors from hinges and draws air, and anything not anchored, back towards the center. In a confined valley, the effect multiplies. Shock waves rebound off rock walls, amplifying the force and extending the reach of destruction. The numbers are not abstract here. A 30 to 40 atmosphere spike, a 3,700 degree inferno, a pressure front that can snake through ventilation shafts and crawl spaces. No sealed door or reinforced wall can promise safety. In this environment, Survival is not a matter of luck or preparation, but of physics, unforgiving, absolute, and indifferent to human intent. Medics working in the aftermath of the strike recorded injuries that defied their training and experience. The logs from the 78th Division's field hospital describe men found with no visible wounds, yet gasping for air, blood frothing at their lips, lungs collapsed under the force of the vacuum, alveoli torn open by a pressure drop that lasted only milliseconds. Autopsy reports from Jalalabad Regional Hospital later confirmed the findings: massive hemorrhagic pulmonary edema, ruptured tympanic membranes, and airways scorched by inhaled fire. Survivors spoke of the air turning to stone, of a moment when breath became impossible. Some staggered out with burns across their faces and hands, clothing fused to skin, unable to hear or speak. The negative pressure phase, measured at -0.5 an atmosphere, pulled at every cavity, rupturing eardrums and tearing at the delicate membranes inside the chest. In these records, the mechanical horror of the TOS-1's blast reveals itself not as shrapnel or flame, but as an invisible force that turns the body's own air into a weapon. Word of the mountain pass obliteration traveled faster than any official communique. Within 48 hours, analysts at the US Defense Intelligence Agency were piecing together fragments from intercepted radio chatter and low-orbit satellite imagery. Their brief, dated October 30th, 1988, described an unusual high-temperature flame weapon capable of saturating an entire grid square, an event that conventional doctrine had deemed impossible. The British Defense Intelligence Memorandum, circulated the following day, flagged the overpressure signatures as anomalous, demanding urgent study of bunker vulnerability and immediate development of countermeasures. NATO's technical bulletins began listing the TOS-1 as a collection priority, instructing reconnaissance satellites to search for the distinctive low-slung turret and launch scars in scorched valleys. Inside the Kremlin, the response was not relief, but alarm. Legal advisors questioned whether the weapon's effects violated the 1977 Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, given its chemical fuel mechanism. The Ministry of Defense responded with Decree 1289K, a censorship order banning any mention of vacuum bomb or thermobaric from Soviet media and official reports. The debate over classification, conventional or chemical, remained unresolved, but the signal was clear: the world had noticed, and the red line had become a point of international scrutiny. Manuals, once confident in the power of concrete and depth, began to read differently after Bashka. Soviet engineering guides, revised in 1989, now called for walls 1/3 thicker and for ventilation shafts to be sealed with pressure-rated panels. The GOST 227-802-91 standard introduced specifications for vent closures that could withstand rapid pressure swings, a direct answer to the phenomenon of aerosol clouds infiltrating through every gap. Bunker blueprints were annotated with new calculations about how much negative pressure a panel could tolerate and how quickly a pressure relief hatch must respond to a vacuum phase. Military engineers, faced with the evidence from the mountain pass, no longer trusted traditional air filtration or standard blast doors. The doctrine shifted. Defense was no longer about stopping fragments, but about surviving a weapon that turned the environment itself into a threat. Field commanders, once confident in the sanctuary of reinforced bunkers, began issuing new orders. Garrison units were no longer allowed to cluster in static positions. Instead, evacuation protocols demanded constant movement. Troops dispersed into smaller, unpredictable groups, shifting between temporary shelters and fallback points. The old doctrine of hunkering down behind concrete gave way to a restless mobility, forced by the knowledge that any fixed location could become a death trap. Command posts, medical stations, even ammunition dumps were spread across wider areas, often connected only by radio and runners. The TOS-1 had rewritten the rules. Survival now depended on never being found in the same place twice. The illusion of safety behind walls had evaporated, replaced by a grim calculus of exposure and escape. The TOS-1 Buratino stands as the ultimate expression of Soviet mechanical horror, a machine that redefined what artillery could inflict. Where earlier weapons battered walls or shattered armor, this system erased the boundary between weapon and environment. Its lineage traces back to a tradition of ever larger guns and rockets, but the Buratino departed from brute force alone. By weaponizing the very air, it transformed atmosphere into ammunition, dissolving the line between inside and out, between cover and exposure. The legacy of that mountain pass is not just a tale of devastation, but a warning. When the air itself becomes the instrument of destruction, no doctrine, no fortification, no tradition of defense can claim immunity. In the years that followed, thermobaric logic would echo through new conflicts, each time reminding commanders and engineers that the ground beneath and the air above could be turned against those who once trusted them most. Today, the TOS-1 remains in active arsenals, its blueprint copied, its physics refined, its vacuum nightmare unleashed in new wars from Syria to Ukraine. Concrete and earth no longer promise safety. Atmosphere itself becomes the weapon. As nations race to perfect these red-line systems, the boundary between defense and annihilation grows disturbingly thin. The era of mechanical horror is not over, it is only evolving.
If you're enjoying this content, subscribe now.